Somewhere below, Wilder was still making his ascent of the high-rise, and his wife might one day be a valuable hostage. Led away, she joined the group of outcast wives who lived with their children in the next apartment, earning their keep by working as house servants. Within days, Mrs. Wilder had regained her strength and self-confidence. No longer stunned and stoop-shouldered, she reminded Royal of the serious and attractive wife of an up-and-coming television journalist who had arrived at the high-rise a year earlier. He noticed that she was clearing away Pangborn's place-setting, returning the immaculate silverware to her tray. "They seem clean enough," Royal told her. "I don't think Dr. Pangborn will notice." When she ignored him and continued to remove the cutlery, Royal asked, "Have you heard from him? I take it he won't be joining me this evening?" "Or any evening. He's decided to decline in future." Mrs. Wilder glanced across the table at Royal, almost as if she had felt a flicker of concern for him. She added, matter-of-factly, "I should be wary of Dr. Pangborn." "I always have been." "When a man like Dr. Pangborn loses his appetite for food, it's reasonable to assume that he has something much more interesting between his teeth, and much more dangerous." Royal listened to her cool advice without comment. He was not surprised that the dinners had come to an end. Both he and Pangborn, anticipating the inevitable breakup of the last clan within the apartment building, had now retired to their quarters at opposite ends of the roof, each taking his women with him. Pangborn had moved into the penthouse once owned by the dead jeweler. Strangely enough, Royal reflected, they would soon be back where they had begun, each tenant isolated within his own apartment. Something warned him to dispense with this meal, but he waited for Mrs. Wilder to serve him. Having survived so far, nothing that the gynecologist could do would put him off his stride. During the past months, almost all traces of his accident had vanished, and Royal felt stronger and more confident than ever before. He had won his attempt to dominate the high-rise, and amply proved his right to rule this huge building, even though at the cost of his marriage. As for the new social order that he hoped to see emerge, he knew now that his original vision of a high-rise aviary had been closer to the truth than he guessed. Without knowing it, he had constructed a gigantic vertical zoo, its hundreds of cages stacked above each other. All the events of the past few months made sense if one realized that these brilliant and exotic creatures had learned to open the doors. Royal sat back as Mrs. Wilder served him. Since his own kitchen lacked any equipment, all his meals were prepared in the apartment next door. Mrs. Wilder reappeared with her tray, stepping over the garbage sacks that lined the hallway. For all their descent into barbarism, the residents of the high-rise remained faithful to their origins and continued to generate a vast amount of refuse. As usual, the main course consisted of a piece of roast meat. Royal never asked about the source of the meat, dog, presumably. The women had the supply situation well in hand. Mrs. Wilder stood beside him, gazing into the night air as Royal tasted the heavily spiced dish. Like a well-trained housekeeper, she was waiting for Royal to give some indication of approval, though she never seemed concerned by either praise or criticism. She spoke in a flat voice, unlike the animated tone she used with Anne and the other women. In fact, Mrs. Wilder spent more time with his wife than Royal did himself. 6 women lived together in the adjacent apartment, ostensibly so that they could be more easily protected from a surprise attack. Sometimes Royal would visit Anne, but there was something daunting about the closely knit group of women, sitting on their beds, surrounded by the garbage sacks, together looking after the Wilder children. Their eyes would watch him as he hesitated in the door, waiting for him to go away. Even Anne had withdrawn from him, partly out of fear of Royal, but also because she realized that he no longer needed her. At last, after all the months of trying to maintain her superior status, Anne had decided to join her fellow residents. "Good. It's excellent, again. Wait, before you go." Royal put down his fork. Casually he asked, "Have you heard anything of him? Perhaps someone has seen him?" Mrs. Wilder shook her head, bored by this roundabout questioning. "Who?" "Your husband, Richard, I think he was called. Wilder." Mrs. Wilder stared down at Royal, shaking her head as if not recognizing him. Royal was certain that she had not only forgotten the identity of her husband, but of all men, including himself. To test this, he placed his hand on her thigh, feeling the strong muscle. Mrs. Wilder stood passively with her tray, unaware of Royal fondling her, partly because she had been molested by so many men during the past months, but also because the sexual assault itself had ceased to have any meaning. When Royal slipped 2 of his fingers into her natal cleft, she reacted, not by pushing his hand away, but by moving it to her waist and lightly holding it there as she would the straying hands of her children. When she'd gone, taking the portion of meat which Royal always left for her, he sat back at the long table. He was glad to see her go. Without asking him, Mrs. Wilder had laundered his white jacket, washing out the bloodstains which had given him not merely his sense of authority, but his whole unseated role within the high-rise. Had she done this deliberately, knowing that it would emasculate him? Royal could still remember the period of endless parties, when the apartment building had been lit up like a drunken liner. Royal had played the role of feudal chief to the hilt, presiding each evening over the council meetings held in his drawing-room. As they sat together in the candlelight, these neurosurgeons, senior academics, and stockbrokers displayed all the talents for intrigue and survival exercised by years of service in industry, commerce, and university life. For all the formal vocabulary of agendas and minutes, proposed and seconded motions, the verbal paraphernalia bequeathed by 100 committee meetings, these were in effect tribal conferences. Here they discussed the latest ruses for obtaining food and women, for defending the upper floors against marauders, their plans for alliance and betrayal. Now the new order had emerged, in which all life within the high-rise revolved around 3 obsessions: security, food, and sex. Leaving the table, Royal picked up a silver candlestick and carried it to the window. All the lights in the high-rise were out. 2 floors, the 40th and the 37th, were left with electric current, but they remained unlit. The darkness was more comforting, a place where real illusions might flourish. 40 floors below, a car turned into the parking lot and threaded its way through the maze of access lanes to its place 200 yards from the building. The driver, wearing a flying jacket and heavy boots, stepped out and hurried head down towards the entrance. Royal guessed that this unknown man was probably the last resident to leave the building and set off for his office. Whoever he was, he had found a route to and from his apartment. Somewhere on the roof, a dog whimpered. Far below, from the mouth of an apartment 20 stories down the cliff face, there was a brief, isolated scream. Whether of pain, lust, or rage no longer mattered. Royal waited, his heart starting to race. A moment later, there was a second scream, a meaningless wail. These cries were the expressions of totally abstracted emotions, detached from the context of events around them. Royal waited, expecting one of his retinue to enter and inform him of the probable reasons for these disturbances. Apart from the women in the next apartment, several of the younger male residents, a gallery owner from the 39th floor and a successful hairdresser from the 38th, usually lounged about in the corridor among the garbage sacks, leaning on their spears and keeping an eye on the staircase barricades. Picking up his chromium cane, Royal left the dining room, a single candle in its silver stick lighting his way. As he stumbled over the black plastic bags, he wondered why they had never heaved them over the side. Presumably they held this rubbish to themselves less from fear of attracting the attention of the outside world than from a need to cling to their own, surround themselves with the mucilage of unfinished meals, bloody bandage scraps, broken bottles that once held the wine that made them drunk, all faintly visible through the semi-opaque plastic. His apartment was empty, the high-ceiling rooms deserted. Cautiously, Royal stepped into the corridor. The guard post by the barricades was unmanned, and no lights gleamed through the doorway of the adjacent apartment where the women lived. Surprised by the absence of light from the usually busy kitchen, Royal walked through the darkened hallway. He kicked aside a child's toy and raised the candlestick above his head, trying to pick out any sleeping human figures in the surrounding rooms. Open suitcases lay on the mattresses that covered the floor of the master bedroom. Royal stood in the doorway, a medley of scents crowding around him in the darkness, brilliant wakes left behind them by these fleeing women. Hesitating for a moment, he reached into the room and switched on the light. The instant electric glow, so unfamiliar after the wavering candlelight and twitching torch beams, shone down on the 6 mattresses in the room. Half-packed suitcases lay on top of each other, as if the women had left at a moment's notice, or at some pre-arranged signal. Most of their clothes had been left behind, and he recognized the trouser suit which Mrs. Wilder had worn to serve his dinner. The racks of Anne's dresses and suits hung in the wardrobes like a store display. The even light, as dead as a time exposure in a police photograph recording a crime, lay across these torn mattresses and discarded clothes, the wine stains on the walls, and the forgotten cosmetics on the floor at his feet. As Royal stared down at him, he could hear a faint hooting noise from the darkened corridor, moving away from him as if emitted by these escaping women. The series of whoops and nasal grunts he had been listening to for days, trying without success to repress them from his mind. Switching off the light, he seized his cane firmly in both hands and left the apartment. Standing outside the door, he listened to the distant sounds, almost an electronic parody of a child's crying. They moved through the apartments at the far end of the floor, metallic and remote, the sounds of the beasts of his private zoo. Chapter 15. The Evening's Entertainment. The evening deepened, and the apartment building withdrew into the darkness. As usual at this hour, the high-rise was silent, as if everyone in the huge building was passing through a border zone. On the roof, the dogs whimpered to themselves. Royal blew out the candles in the dining room and made his way up the steps to the penthouse. Reflecting the distant lights of the neighboring high-rises, the chromium shafts of the calisthenic machine seemed to move up and down like columns of mercury, a complex device recording the shifting psychological levels of the residents below. As Royal stepped onto the roof, the darkness was lit by the white forms of hundreds of birds. Their wings flared in the dark air as they struggled to find a perch on the crowded elevator heads and balustrades. Royal waited until they surrounded him, steering their beaks away from his legs with his stick. He felt himself becoming calm again. If the women and the other members of his dwindling entourage had decided to leave him, so much the better. Here in the darkness among the birds, listening to them swoop and cry, the dogs whimpering in the children's sculpture garden, he felt most at home. He was convinced more than ever that the birds were attracted here by his own presence. Royal scattered the birds out of his way and pushed back the gates of the sculpture garden. As they recognized him, the dogs began to whine and strain, pulling against their leads. These retrievers, poodles, and dachshunds were all that remained of the 100 or so animals who had once lived in the upper floors of the high-rise. They were kept here as a strategic food reserve, but Royal had seen to it that few of them had been eaten. The dogs formed his personal hunting pack, to be kept until the final confrontation when he would lead them down into the building and throw open the windows of the barricaded apartments to admit the birds. The dogs pulled at his legs, their leads entangled around the play sculptures. Even Royal's favorite, the white Alsatian, was restless and on edge. Royal tried to settle it, running his hands over the luminous but still blood-stained coat. The dog butted him nervously, knocking him back across the empty food pails. As Royal regained his balance, he heard the sound of voices surging up the central stairway 100 feet behind him. Lights approached through the darkness, a procession of electric torches held at shoulder height. The beams of light cut through the night air, scattering birds into the sky. A portable cassette player boomed out its music over the clicking of dumbbells. As Royal paused behind an elevator head, a group of his top-floor neighbors erupted onto the roof. Led by Pangborn, they spread in a loose circle across the observation deck, ready to celebrate a recent triumph. Without Royal's approval or foreknowledge, a raid had taken place on the floors below. The gynecologist was in high excitement, waving the last stragglers up the staircase like a demented courier. From his mouth came a series of peculiar whoops and cries, barely articulated grunts that sounded like some Neanderthal mating call. 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 But, in fact, were Pangborn's rendering of the recorded birth cries analyzed by his computer. These eerie and unsettling noises Royal had been forced to listen to for weeks, as members of his entourage took up the refrain. A few days earlier he had finally banned the making of these noises altogether, sitting in the penthouse and trying to think about the birds. It unnerved him to hear the women in the kitchen next door emitting these clicks and grunts. However, Pangborn held regular sessions in his own quarters at the opposite end of the roof, where he would play through his library of recorded birth cries for the benefit of the women crouching in a hushed circle on the floor around him. Together they mimicked these weird noises, an oral emblem of Pangborn's growing authority. Now they had left Royal, but were giving full vent to everything they had learned, hooting and growling like a troop of demented mothers-to-be invoking their infants' birth traumas. Waiting for the right moment to make his entrance, Royal heeled the Alsatian behind a tattered awning that leaned against the elevator head. For once he was glad that he was wearing his tuxedo. The white safari jacket would have stood out like a flame. 2 guests had been picked up. A cost accountant from the 32nd floor with a bandaged head, and a myopic meteorologist from the 27th. The woman carrying the cassette player, he noted calmly, was his wife, Anne. Sloppily dressed, her hair in a mess, she lolled against Pangborn's shoulder, and then wandered about in the circle of torchlight like a moody trollop, brandishing the cassette player at the 2 prisoners. "Ladies, please now, there's more to come." Pangborn calmed the women, his slim fingers like brittle sticks in the confused light. The portable bar was lifted upright. A table and 2 chairs were set beside it, and the guests uneasily took their seats. The cost accountant was trying to straighten the unraveling bandage around his head, as if frightened that he might be called upon to play blind man's bluff. The meteorologist squinted short-sightedly into the torchlight, hoping to recognize someone among those taking part in this revel. Royal knew everyone present, his neighbors of the past year, and could almost believe that he was attending one of the many cocktail parties held on the roof that summer. At the same time, he felt that he was watching the opening act of a stylized opera or ballet, in which a restaurant is reduced to a single table, and the doomed hero is taunted by a chorus of waiters before being dispatched to his death. The hosts at this party had been drinking long before the 2 guests arrived. The jeweler's widow in the long fur coat, Anne with a cassette player, Jane Sheridan waving a cocktail shaker, all were lurching about as if to some deranged music only Royal was unable to hear. Pangborn called for quiet again. "Now, keep our guests amused. They're looking bored. What are we playing tonight?" A medley of suggestions were shouted out. "Gangplank." "Flying School, Doctor." "Moonwalk." Pangborn turned to his guests. I rather like Flying School. Did you know we've been running a flying school here? No? We've decided to offer you some free lessons, Anne Royal told them. 1 free lesson, Pangborn corrected. Everyone sniggered at this. But that's all you'll need, isn't it, Anne? It's a remarkably effective course. Solo first time, in fact. Already led by the jeweler's widow, they were dragging the injured accountant towards the balustrade, everyone tripping over the blood-stained bandage unwrapping around his head. A pair of tattered papier-mâché wings, part of a child's angel costume, were fastened to the victim's back. The grunting and hooting began again. Dragging the reluctant Alsatian after him, Royal stepped into view. Involved in their imminent execution, no one noticed him. As casually as he could muster, he called out, "Pangborn! Dr. Pangborn!" The noise slackened. Torch beams flicked through the darkness, whipping across Royal's silk-lapelled dinner jacket, fixing on the white Alsatian trying to escape between his feet. "Flying school! Flying school!" The sullen chant was taken up. Looking down at this unruly gang, Royal could almost believe that he was surrounded by a crowd of semi-literate children. The zoo had rebelled against its keeper. Hearing Royal's voice, the gynecologist turned from his prisoner, whose bandage he had expertly refastened. Wiping his hands, he strolled across the roof, almost mimicking Royal's casual saunter. But his eyes were examining Royal's face with a wholly professional curiosity, as if he had already decided that its expression of firm determination could be readjusted by cutting a minimum number of nerves and muscles. The chant rose into the air. The torch beams beat rhythmically across the darkness, striking Royal's face. He waited patiently for the clamor to subside. As Anne broke away from the crowd and ran forward, he raised the chromium cane, ready to strike her. She stopped in front of him, smirking as she fluffed up her long skirt in a provocative gesture. Suddenly she turned the cassette player to full volume and thrust it into his face. A gabble of birth cries filled the air. "Royal!" the jeweler's widow shouted warningly. "Here's Wilder!" Startled by the name, Royal flinched back, thrashing at the darkness with the chromium cane. The torch beams swerved around him, the shadows of the overturned chairs swinging across the concrete roof. Expecting Wilder to lunge at him from behind, he stumbled across the awning and entangled himself in the dog's lead. He heard laughter behind him. Controlling himself with an effort, he turned to face Pangborn again. But the gynecologist was walking away, looking back at him without hostility. He waved to Royal with a quick movement of his hand, as if flicking a dart at him, dismissing him forever. The torches swung away from Royal, and everyone returned to the more serious business of tormenting the two guests. Royal watched from the darkness as they argued over the prisoners. The confrontation with Pangborn was over, or, more exactly, had never taken place. A simple ruse had unnerved him, leaving him with the uncertainty of whether or not he really feared Wilder. He had been humiliated, but in a sense this was only just. The gynecologist was the man for their hour. No zoo would survive for long with Pangborn as its keeper, but he would provide a node of violence and cruelty that would keep alive in others the will to survive. Let the psychotics take over. They alone understood what was happening. Holding to the Alsatian, Royal let the dog drag him away towards the safety of the darkness near the sculpture garden. The white forms of the birds were massed together on every ledge and parapet. Royal listened to the whimpering dogs. He had no means now of feeding them. The glass doors of the penthouse reflected the swerving birds like the casements of a secret pavilion. He would close down his apartment, block the staircase, and retreat to the penthouse, perhaps taking Mrs. Wilder with him as his servant. Here he would preside over the high-rise, taking up his last tenancy in the sky. He unlocked the gate of the sculpture garden and moved through the darkness among the statues, releasing the dogs. One by one they scrambled away, until only Royal and the birds were left. Chapter 16. A Happy Arrangement. An uncertain scene, Robert Lang decided. He could no longer trust his senses. A curious light, gray and humid, but at the same time marbled by a faint interior luminosity, hung over the apartment. As he stood among the garbage sacks in the kitchen, trying to coax a few drops of water from the tap, he peered over his shoulder at the dull fog that stretched like a curtain across the sitting room, almost an extension of his own mind. Not for the first time he was unsure what time of day it was. How long had he been up? Lang vaguely remembered sleeping on the tartan rug that lay on the kitchen floor, his head pillowed on a garbage sack between the table legs. He had been wandering about the bedroom where Sister Alice lay asleep, but whether he had woken 5 minutes ago or the previous day, Lang had no means of telling. He shook his watch, picking at the fractured dial with a grimy fingernail. The watch had stopped during a scuffle in the 25th floor lobby several days earlier. Although he had forgotten the exact moment, the hands of this broken watch contained the one point of finite time left to him, like a fossil cast onto a beach, crystallizing forever a brief sequence of events within a vanished ocean. However, it barely mattered now what time it was, anything rather than night, when it was too terrifying to do more than shelter in the apartment. crouching behind his dilapidated barricade. Lang turned the cold water tap on and off, listening to the faintly changing tone. At rare intervals, perhaps for a single minute during the day, a green, algae-stained liquid flowed from the tap. These small columns of water, moving up and down the huge systems of pipes that ran throughout the building, announced their arrivals and departures with faint changes of note. Listening to this remote and complex music had sharpened Lang's ears, a sensitivity that extended to almost any kind of sound within the building. By contrast, his sight, dulled by being used chiefly at night, presented him with an increasingly opaque world. Little movement took place within the high-rise. As Lang often reminded himself, almost everything that could happen had already taken place. He left the kitchen and squeezed himself into the narrow niche between the front door and the barricade. He placed his right ear to the sounding panel of the wooden door. From the minute reverberations he could tell instantly if a marauder was moving through the abandoned apartments nearby. During the brief period each afternoon when he and Steele emerged from their apartments, a token remembrance of that time when people had actually left the building, they would take turns, standing with their hands pressed against the metal walls of an elevator shaft, feeling the vibrations transmitted to their bodies, picking up a sudden movement 15 floors above or below. Crouched on the staircase with their fingers on the metal rails, they listened to the secret murmurs of the building, the distant spasms of violence that communicated themselves like bursts of radiation from another universe. The high-rise quivered with these tremors, sinister trickles of sound as a wounded tenant crawled up a stairway. A trap closed around a wild dog. An unwary prey went down before a club. Today, however, befitting this timeless zone with its uncertain light, there was no sound at all. Lang returned to the kitchen and listened to the water pipes, part of a huge acoustic system operated by thousands of stops. This dying musical instrument they had once all played together. But everything was quiet. The residents of the high-rise remained where they were, hiding behind the barricades in their apartments, conserving what was left of their sanity, and preparing themselves for the night. By now what violence there was had become totally stylized, spasms of cold and random aggression. In a sense, life in the high-rise had begun to resemble the world outside. There were the same ruthlessness and aggression concealed within a set of polite conventions. Still uncertain how long he had been awake, or what he had been doing half an hour earlier, Lang sat down among the empty bottles and refuse on the kitchen floor. He gazed up at the derelict washing machine and refrigerator, now only used as garbage bins. He found it hard to remember what their original function had been. To some extent they had taken on a new significance, a role that he had yet to understand. Even the run-down nature of the high-rise was a model of the world into which the future was carrying them, a landscape beyond technology where everything was either derelict or, more ambiguously, recombined in unexpected but more meaningful ways. Lang pondered this. Sometimes he found it difficult not to believe that they were living in a future that had already taken place, and was now exhausted. Squatting beside his dried-up water-hole like a desert nomad with all the time in the world, Lang waited patiently for the taps to flow. He picked at the dirt on the backs of his hands. Despite his tramp-like appearance, he dismissed the notion of using the water to wash. The high-rise stank. None of the lavatories or garbage disposal chutes were working, and a faint spray of urine hung over the face of the building, drifting across the tiers of balconies. Overlaying this characteristic odor, however, was a far more ambiguous smell, putrid and sweet, that tended to hover around empty apartments, and which Lang chose not to investigate too closely. For all its inconveniences, Lang was satisfied with life in the high-rise. Now that so many of the residents were out of the way, he felt able to relax, more in charge of himself, and ready to move forward and explore his life. How and where, exactly, he had not yet decided. His real concern was with his sister. Alice had fallen ill with a nonspecific malaise, and spent her time lying on the mattress in Lang's bedroom, or wandering half-naked around the apartment, her body shuddering like an oversensitive seismograph at imperceptible tremors that shook the building. When Lang drummed on the waste pipe below the sink, sending a hollow drone through the empty pipe, Alice called out from the bedroom in her thin voice. Lang went in to see her, picking his way among the piles of kindling he had made from chopped-up furniture. He enjoyed cutting up the chairs and tables. Alice pointed to him with a stick-like hand. "The noise. You're signalling again to someone. Who is it now?" "No one, Alice. Who do you think we know?" "Those people on the lower floors, the ones you like." Lang stood beside her, uncertain whether to sit on the mattress. His sister's face was as greasy as a wax lemon. Trying to focus on him, her tired eyes drifted about in her head like lost fish. It crossed his mind briefly that she might be dying. During the past 2 days they had eaten no more than a few fillets of canned smoked salmon, which he had found under the floorboards in an empty apartment. Ironically, the standard of cuisine in the apartment building had begun to rise during these days of its greatest decline, as more and more delicacies came to light. However, food was a secondary matter, and Alice was very much alive in other ways. Lang enjoyed her wheedling criticisms of him, as he tried to satisfy her pointless whims. All this was a game, but he relished the role of over-dutiful servant dedicated to a waspish mistress, a devoted menial, whose chief satisfaction was a total lack of appreciation and the endless recitation of his faults. In many ways, in fact, his relationship with Alice recapitulated that which his wife had unthinkingly tried to create, hitting by accident on the one possible source of harmony between them, and which Lang had rejected at the time. Within the high-rise, he reflected, his marriage would have succeeded triumphantly. "I'm trying to find some water, Alice. You'd like a little tea?" "The kettle smells." "I'll wash it for you. You mustn't become dehydrated." She nodded grudgingly. "What's been happening?" "Nothing. It's already happened." A ripe but not unpleasant smell rose from Alice's body. "Everything is starting to get back to normal." "What about Alan? You said you'd look for him." "I'm afraid he's gone." Lang disliked these references to Alice's husband. They introduced a discordant note. "I found your apartment, but it's empty now." Alice turned her head away, indicating that she had seen enough of her brother. Lang bent down and gathered together the kindling she had scattered on the floor beside the mattress. These dining-room chair legs, well impregnated with glue and varnish, would burn briskly. Lang had looted the chairs from Adrian Talbot's apartment after the psychiatrist's disappearance. He was grateful for this reproduction Hepplewhite. The conventional tastes of the middle-floor residents had served them well. By contrast, those in the lower floor levels found themselves with a clutter of once fashionable chromium tubing and undressed leather, useless for anything but sitting on. All cooking was done now over fires which the residents lit for themselves on their balconies, or in the artificial fireplaces. Lang carried the sticks onto the balcony. As he squatted there, he realized that he had nothing to cook. The secret cache of cans he had long ago been obliged to surrender to the orthodontic surgeon next door. In fact, Lang's position was secure thanks only to the morphine ampules he had concealed. Although Steele frightened him with his unpredictable cruelties, Lang had attached himself to him out of necessity. So many people had gone, or dropped out of the struggle altogether. Had they deserted the high-rise for the world outside? Lang was sure that they had not. In a sense, he depended on the uncertainties of his relationship with the dentist, following his murderous swings like a condemned prisoner in love with a moody jailer. During the previous weeks, Steele's behavior had become frightening. The deliberately mindless assaults on anyone found alone or unprotected, the infantile smearing of blood on the walls of empty apartments. All these Lang watched uneasily. Since his wife's disappearance, Steele had been as tautly strung as the huge crossbows which he constructed from piano wire and mounted in the lobbies and corridors, their vicious arrows fashioned from the shafts of golf clubs. At the same time, however, Steele remained largely calm, as if pursuing some unknown quest. Steele slept in the afternoon, giving Lang a chance to prospect for water. As he picked up the kettle, he heard Alice call out to him, but when he returned to her, she had already forgotten what she wanted. She held out her hands to him. Usually Lang would have rubbed them for her, trying to kindle a little warmth in them. but out of some kind of peculiar loyalty to the dentist, he made no effort to help Alice. This petty show of callousness, his declining personal hygiene, and even his deliberate neglect of his health were elements in a system he made no attempt to change. For weeks all he had been able to think about were the next raid, the next apartment to be ransacked, the next tenant to be beaten up. He enjoyed watching Steele at work, obsessed with these expressions of mindless violence. Each one brought them a step closer to the ultimate goal of the high-rise, a realm where their most deviant impulses were free at last to exercise themselves in any way they wished. At this point, physical violence would cease at last. Lang waited for Alice to subside into half-consciousness. Looking after his sister was taking up more of his energy than he could afford. If she was dying, there was little he could do, apart from giving her a terminal gram of morphine and hiding her body before Steele could mutilate it. Dressing up corpses and setting them in grotesque tableaux was a favorite pastime of the dentist's. His imagination, repressed by all the years of reconstructing his patients' mouths, came alive particularly when he was playing with the dead. The previous day Lang had blundered into an apartment and found him painting a bizarre cosmetic mask on the face of a dead account executive, dressing the body like an overblown drag queen in a voluminous silk nightdress. Given time, and a continuing supply of subjects, the dentist would repopulate the entire high-rise. Carrying the kettle, Lang let himself out of the apartment. The same dim light, pearled by a faint interior glow, filled the corridor and elevator lobby, a miasma secreted by the high-rise itself, distillation of all its dead concrete. The walls were spattered with blood, overlaying the aerosoled graffiti like the darkest explosions in the paintings that filled the top-floor apartments. Broken furniture and unraveled recording tape lay among the garbage sacks piled against the walls. Lang's feet crackled among the Polaroid negatives scattered about the corridor floor, each recording a long-forgotten act of violence. As he paused, wary of attracting the attention of a watching predator, the staircase doors opened, and a man in a flying jacket and fleece-lined boots entered the lobby. Watching Paul Crosland stride purposefully across the debris-strewn carpet, Lang realized that the television announcer had just returned, as he did every day, from reading the lunchtime news bulletin at the television station. Crosland was the only person to leave the high-rise, maintaining a last tenuous link with the outside world. Even Steele sidestepped him discreetly. A few people still watched him read the news on their battery-powered sets, crouching among the garbage sacks behind their barricades, perhaps still hoping that even now Crosland might suddenly depart from his set text and blurt out to the world at large what was happening within the high-rise. Inside the staircase, Lang had set up a dog trap, using a tropical mosquito net he had lifted from an anthropologist's apartment 3 floors above. A plague of dogs had descended the building from their breeding grounds on the upper floors. Lang had no hopes of catching the larger dogs in the spring-loaded contraption, but a dachshund or a Pekingese might become entangled in the nylon mesh. The staircase was unguarded. Taking a chance, Lang made his way down the steps to the floor below. The lobby was blocked by a barricade of furniture, and he turned into the corridor that served the 10 apartments in the northern wing of the building. 3 doors along, he entered an abandoned apartment. The rooms were empty, the furniture and fittings long ago stripped away. In the kitchen, Lang tried the taps. With his sheath knife he cut the hoses of the washing machine and dishwasher, collecting a cupful of metallic water. In the bathroom, the naked body of an elderly tax specialist lay on the tiled floor. Without thinking, Lang stepped over him. He wandered around the apartment, picking up an empty whiskey decanter on the floor. A faint odor of malt whiskey clung to it, an almost intoxicating nostalgia. Lang moved to the next apartment, also abandoned and gutted. In a bedroom he noticed that the carpet covered a small circular depression. Suspecting a secret food cache, he rolled back the carpet and found that a manhole had been drilled through the wooden floorboards and concrete deck to the apartment below. After sealing the door, Lang lay down on the floor and peered into the room beneath. A circular glass table, by a miracle still intact, reflected his blood-spattered shirt and bearded face, staring up from what seemed to be the bottom of a deep well. Beside the table were 2 overturned armchairs. The balcony doors were closed, and curtains hung on either side of the windows. Looking down at this placid scene, Lang felt that he had accidentally been given a glimpse into a parallel world, where the laws of the high-rise were suspended, a magical domain, where these huge buildings were furnished and decorated, but never occupied. On an impulse, Lang eased his thin legs through the manhole. He sat on the ledge and swung himself down into the room below. Standing on the glass table, he surveyed the apartment. Hard experience told him that he was not alone. Somewhere a miniature bell was ringing. A faint scratching came from the bedroom, as if a small animal was trying to escape from a paper sack. Lang pushed back the bedroom door. A red-haired woman in her mid-30s lay fully dressed on the bed, playing with a Persian cat. The creature wore a velvet collar and bell, and its lead was attached to the woman's bloodied wrist. The cat vigorously licked at the bloodstains on its coat, and then seized the woman's wrist and gnawed at the thin flesh, trying to reopen a wound. The woman, whom Lang vaguely recognized as Eleanor Powell, made no effort to stop the cat from dining off her flesh. Her serious face, with its blue cyanosed hue, was inclined over the cat like that of a tolerant parent watching a child at play. Her left hand lay across the silk bedspread, touching a pencil and a reporter's notepad. Facing her, at the foot of the bed, were 4 television sets. They were tuned to different stations, but 3 of the screens were blank. On the 4th, a battery-powered set, the out-of-focus picture of a horse race was being projected soundlessly. Uninterested in her reviewing, Eleanor teased her bloodied wrist into the cat's mouth. The creature was ravenous, tearing excitedly at the flesh around the knuckle. Lang tried to pull the cat away, but Eleanor jerked at the lead, urging it back onto the wound. "I'm keeping her alive," she told Lang reprovingly. The cat's attentions brought a serene smile to her face. She raised her left hand. "Doctor, you may suckle my other wrist. Poor man, you look thin enough." Lang listened to the sounds of the cat's teeth. The apartment was silent, and the noise of his own excited breathing was magnified to an uncanny extent. Would he soon be the last person alive in the high-rise? He thought of himself in this enormous building, free to roam its floors and concrete galleries, to climb its silent elevator shafts, to sit by himself in turn on every one of its 1,000 balconies. This dream, longed for since his arrival at the high-rise, suddenly unnerved him, almost as if, at last alone here, he had heard footsteps in the next room and come face to face with himself. He turned up the volume of the television set. A racetrack commentator's voice emerged from the speaker, a gabble of names that sounded like a demented inventory, a list of unrelated objects being recruited to repopulate the high-rise in an emergency transfusion of identity. "What? Where's the program?" Eleanor raised her head, peering disjointedly at the television set. Her left hand scrambled around for the dictation pad and pencil. "What's he saying?" Lang slipped his arms under her. He intended to carry her, but her thin body was surprisingly heavy. He was weaker than he had thought. "Can you walk? I'll come back later for the set." She shrugged vaguely, swaying against Lang like a drunk in a bar, accepting a dubious proposition from an old acquaintance. Sitting beside him on the edge of the bed, she leaned an arm on his shoulder, inspecting him with a shrewd eye. She tapped Lang aggressively on the arm. "All right. First thing, though, find some batteries." Of course. Her show of willfulness was pleasantly encouraging. As she watched from the bed, he pulled a suitcase from the wardrobe and began to fill it with her clothes. So Lang took Eleanor Powell and her portable television set back to his apartment. He arranged her on a mattress in the living room and spent his days hunting the abandoned apartments for food, water, and batteries. The reappearance of television in his life convinced Lang that everything in the high-rise was becoming normal again. When Steele moved on to the richer pastures above, Lang declined his offer to join him. Already Lang had decided to separate himself and his 2 women from everyone else. He needed to be alone with Alice and Eleanor, to be as aggressive and self-reliant, as passive and submissive as he wished. He had little idea at this early stage of what role he would play with these two women, but whatever he chose, he would have to play it out within his own walls. Lang knew that he was far happier now than ever before. Despite all the hazards of his life, the likelihood that he would die at any time from hunger or assault. He was satisfied by his self-reliance, his ability to cope with the tasks of survival. Foraging, keeping his wits about him, guarding his two women from any marauder who might want to use them for similar purposes. Above all, he was pleased with his good sense in giving rein to those impulses that involved him with Eleanor and his sister, perversities created by the limitless possibilities of the high-rise. Chapter 17. The Lakeside Pavilion. As if nervous of disturbing the interior of the apartment building, the morning sun explored the half-shuttered skylight of the 40th floor stairwell, slipped between the broken panes, and fell obliquely down the steps. Shivering in the cold air 5 floors below, Richard Wilder watched the sunlight approach him. He sat on the steps, leaning against a dining-room table which formed part of a massive barricade blocking the staircase. After crouching here all night, Wilder was frozen. The higher up the building he moved, the colder it became, and at times he had been tempted to retreat to the floors below. He looked down at the animal crouching beside him, a black poodle he guessed it had once been, envying its shaggy coat. His own body was almost naked, and he rubbed at the lipstick smeared across his chest and shoulders, trying to insulate himself with this sweet grease. The dog's eyes were fixed on the landing above. Its ears pricked as it detected the sounds, inaudible to Wilder, of someone moving behind the barricade. During their 10 days together, the two had formed a successful hunting team, and Wilder was reluctant to urge the dog to attack before it was ready. The threadbare remains of Wilder's trousers, cut away at the knees, were stained with blood and wine. A ragged beard covered his heavy face, partly concealing an open wound on his jaw. He looked derelict and exhausted, but in fact his body was as strongly muscled as ever. His broad chest was covered with a hatchwork of painted lines, a vivid display that spread across his shoulders and back. At intervals he inspected the design, which he had painted the previous afternoon with a lipstick he had found in an abandoned apartment. What had begun as a drunk, fuddled game had soon taken on a serious ritual character. The markings, apart from frightening the few other people he might come across, gave him a potent sense of identity. As well, they celebrated his long and now virtually successful ascent of the high-rise. Determined to look his best when he finally stepped onto the roof, Wilder licked his scarred fingers, massaging himself with one hand and freshening up his design with the other. He held the dog's leash in a strong grip and watched the landing 10 steps above him. The sun, continuing its labored descent of the stairwell, at last reached him and began to warm his skin. Wilder looked up at the skylight 60 feet above his head. The rectangle of white sky became more and more unreal as it drew closer, like the artificial ceiling of a film set. The dog quivered, edging its paws forwards. Only a few yards from them someone was straightening part of the barricade. Wilder waited patiently, moving the dog up 1 step. For all the savage-like ferocity of his appearance, Wilder's behavior was a model of restraint. Having come this far, he had no intention of being caught unawares. He peered through a crack in the dining table. Behind the barricade, someone pulled back a small mahogany writing desk that served as a concealed door. Through this gap appeared an almost bald woman of about 70. Her tough face peered into the stairwell. After a wary pause, she stepped through the gap to the landing rail, a champagne bucket in one hand. She was dressed in the remnants of an expensive evening gown, which exposed the mottled white skin of her muscular arms and shoulders. Wilder watched her with respect. He had tangled with these crones more than once, and he was well aware that they were capable of a surprising turn of speed. Without moving, he waited as she leaned over the landing rail and emptied the slops from the champagne bucket. The cold grease spattered Wilder and the dog, but neither made any response. Wilder carefully wiped the cinecamera lying on the step beside him. Its lenses had been fractured during the skirmishes and assaults that had brought him to the roof of the high-rise, but the camera's role was now wholly emblematic. He felt the same identification with the camera that he did with the dog. However, for all his affection and loyalty towards the animal, the dog would soon be leaving him. They would both be present at a celebratory dinner when they reached the roof, he reflected, with a touch of gallows humor, but the poodle would be in the pot. Thinking of this supper to come, his first decent meal for weeks, Wilder watched the old woman muttering about. He wiped his beard and cautiously raised himself from his knees. He pulled the dog's lead, a length of electrical cord, and hissed between his broken teeth. As if on cue, the dog whimpered. It stood up, shivering, and climbed 2 steps. In full view of the old woman, it crouched down and began to whine plaintively. The old woman retreated swiftly behind her barricade. Within seconds, a heavy carving knife materialized in her hand. Her canny eyes peered down at the dog cringing on the steps below her. As it rolled onto its side and exposed its loins, her eyes were riveted on its fleshy stomach and shoulders. As the dog whimpered again, Wilder watched from behind the dining table. This moment never failed to amuse him. In fact, the higher he climbed the building, the greater its potential for humor. He still held the lead, which trailed behind the dog down the steps, but was careful to leave it loose. The old woman, unable to take her eyes off the dog, stepped through the gap in the barricade. She whistled through the gap in her false teeth and beckoned the dog forward. "Poor pet, you're lost, aren't you, Beauty? Come on, up here." Barely able to contain his glee at the spectacle of this bald-headed crone fawning with exaggerated pathos over the dog, Wilder leaned against the table, laughing soundlessly to himself. At any moment she would be in for a shock, his heavy boot on her neck. Behind the barricade a second figure appeared. A young woman of about 30, probably the daughter, peered over the old woman's shoulder. Her suede jacket was unbuttoned to reveal a pair of grimy breasts, but her hair was elaborately wound into a mass of rollers, as if she were preparing parts of her body for some formal gala to which the rest of herself had not been invited. The 2 women stared down at the dog, their faces expressionless. As the daughter waited with the carving knife, the mother edged down the steps. Muttering reassuringly, she patted the poodle on the head and bent down to take the lead. As her strong fingers closed around the cord, Wilder leapt forward. The dog sprang to life, hurled itself up the steps, and sank its teeth into the old woman's arm. With surprising agility, she darted through the gap in the barricade. The dog clamped to her arm. Barely in time, Wilder followed her, kicking back the writing desk before the daughter could lock it into place. He dragged the poodle from the old woman's bloodied arm, seized her by the neck, and flung her sideways across a stack of cardboard cartons. She lay there, stunned, like a disheveled duchess surprised to find herself drunk at a ball. As Wilder turned away, wrestling with the dog, the daughter ran towards him. She had thrown the carving knife aside. In one hand she held her hair curlers, in the other a silver handbag pistol. Wilder sidestepped out of her way, knocked the pistol from her hand, and clubbed her backwards across the barricade. As the 2 women sat panting on the floor, Wilder looked down at the pistol at his feet. Little more than a child's bright toy. He picked it up and began to inspect his new domain. He was standing in the entrance to the 35th floor swimming pool. The tank of fetid water, filled with debris, reflected the garbage sacks heaped around the tiled verge. A small den had been built inside a stationary elevator in the lobby. Beside a burnt-out fire, an elderly man, a former tax consultant, Wilder seemed to recall, lay asleep, apparently unaware of the spasm of violence that had taken place. A chimney flue, fashioned from 2 lengths of balcony drainage pipe, exited over his head through the roof of the elevator. Still holding the pistol, Wilder watched the 2 women. The mother sat among the cardboard cartons, matter-of-factly bandaging her arm with a strip torn from her silk dress. The daughter squatted on the floor by the barricade, rubbing the bruise on her mouth, and patting the head of Wilder's poodle. Wilder peered up the staircase to the 36th floor. The skirmish had excited him, and he was tempted to press on all the way to the roof. However, he had not eaten for more than a day, and the smell of animal fat hung in the air around the fire by the entrance to the den. Wilder beckoned the young woman towards him. Her bland, rather bovine face was vaguely familiar. Had she once been the wife of a film company executive? She climbed to her feet and walked up to him, staring with interest at the emblems painted across his chest and shoulders, and at his exposed genitals. Pocketing the pistol, Wilder pulled her towards the den. They stepped over the old man and entered the elevator. Curtains hung from the walls, and 2 mattresses covered the floor. Holding the young woman to him, an arm around her shoulders, Wilder sat down against the rear wall of the elevator. He gazed across the lobby at the yellow water of the swimming pool. Several of the changing cubicles had been converted into small single-tenant cabins, but they were all now abandoned. 2 bodies, he noted, floated in the pool, barely distinguishable from the other debris, the kitchen garbage, and pieces of furniture. Wilder helped himself to the last of the small cat that had been barbecued above the fire. His teeth pulled at the stringy meat, the still warm fat almost intoxicating him as he sucked at the skewer. The young woman leaned affably against him, content to have Wilder's strong arm around her shoulders. The fresh smell of her body surprised him. The higher up the apartment building he moved, the cleaner were the women. Wilder looked down at her unmarked face, as open and amiable as a domestic animal's. She seemed to have been totally untouched by events within the high-rise, as if waiting in some kind of insulated chamber for Wilder to appear. He tried to speak to her, but found himself grunting, unable to form the words with his broken teeth and scarred tongue. Pleasantly high on the meat, he lay back comfortably against the young woman, playing with the silver handbag pistol. Without thinking, he opened the front of her suede jacket and loosened her breasts. He placed his hands over the small nipples and settled himself against her. He felt drowsy, murmuring to the young woman while she stroked the painted stripes on his chest and shoulders, her fingers moving endlessly across his skin as if writing a message to him. Lying back in this comfortable lakeside pavilion, Wilder rested during the early afternoon. The young woman sat beside him, her breasts against his face, nursing this huge, nearly naked man with his painted body and exposed loins. Her mother and father pottered about in the lobby. Now and then the old woman in her evening gown pulled a piece of furniture at random from the barricade and chopped it into kindling with the carving knife. Wilder ignored them, conscious only of the young woman's body and the huge pillars that carried the apartment building upwards to the roof. Through the windows around the swimming pool he could see the towers of the 4 high-rise blocks nearby, suspended like rectilinear clouds within the afternoon sky. The warmth within the elevator, which seemed to emanate from the young woman's breasts, had drained all will and energy from him. Her calm face gazed down at Wilder reassuringly. She had accepted him as she would any marauding hunter. First, she would try to kill him, but failing this, give him food and her body, breastfeed him back to a state of childishness, and even, perhaps, feel affection for him. Then, the moment he was asleep, cut his throat. The synopsis of the ideal marriage. Rallying himself, Wilder sat up and put his boot into the poodle lying asleep on the mattress outside the elevator. The yelp of pain revived Wilder. He pushed the young woman away. He needed to sleep, but first he would move to a safer hiding place, or the crone and her daughter would make short work of him. Without looking back, he stood up and dragged the dog behind him. He slipped the silver pistol into the waistband of his trousers and checked the patterns on his chest and shoulders. Carrying the cinecamera, he climbed past the barricade and re-entered the staircase, leaving behind the quiet encampment and the young woman beside her yellow lake. As he moved up the steps, everything was silent. The staircase was carpeted, muffling the tread of his boots, and he was too distracted by the sounds of his own breathing to notice that the walls around him had been freshly painted, their white surfaces gleaming in the afternoon sunlight like the entrance to an abattoir. Wilder climbed to the 37th floor, smelling the icy air moving across his naked body from the open sky. He could hear now, more clearly than ever before, the crying of gulls. When the dog began to whimper, Reluctant to go any further, he turned it loose and watched it disappear down the stairs. The 37th floor was deserted, apartment doors open on the bright air. Too exhausted to think, he found an empty apartment, barricaded himself into the living room, and sank into a deep sleep on the floor. Chapter 18. The Blood Garden. By contrast, Anthony Royal, high on the open roof 3 floors above, had never been more awake. Ready at last to join the seabirds, he stood at the windows of his penthouse, looking out over the open plazas of the development project towards the distant mouth of the river. Washed by the recent rain, the morning air was clear but frozen, and the river flowed from the city like a stream of ice. 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 For 2 days Royal had eaten nothing, but far from exhausting him, the absence of food had stimulated every nerve and muscle in his body. The shrieking of the gulls filled the air and seemed to tear at the exposed tissues of his brain. They rose from the elevator heads and balustrades in a continuous fountain, soared into the air to form an expanding vortex, and dived down again towards the sculpture garden. Royal was now certain that they were calling for him. He had been deserted by the dogs. As soon as he freed them, they had disappeared into the stairways and corridors below, and only the white Alsatian remained. It sat at Royal's feet by the open windows, mesmerized by the movement of the birds. Its wounds had healed now, and its thick Arctic coat was white again. Royal missed the stains, as he did the bloody handprints that Mrs. Wilder had washed from his jacket. The little food Royal had taken with him before sealing himself into the penthouse he had given to the dog. But already he felt himself beyond hunger. For 3 days he had seen no one, and was glad to have cut himself off from his wife and neighbors. Looking up at the whirling cloud of gulls, he knew that they were the true residents of the high-rise. Without realizing it at the time, he had designed the sculpture garden for them alone. Royal shivered in the cold air. He wore his safari jacket, and the thin linen gave him no protection against the wind moving across the concrete roof. In the overlit air, the white fabric was gray by comparison with Royal's chalk-like skin. Barely able to control himself, and uncertain whether the scars of his accident had begun to reopen themselves, he stepped onto the terrace and walked across the roof. The gulls sidled around him, rolling their heads and wiping their beaks against the concrete. The surface was streaked with blood. For the first time Royal saw that the ledges and balustrades were covered with these bloody notches, the symbols of a mysterious calligraphy. Voices sounded in the distance, a murmur of women. In the central section of the observation deck, beyond the sculpture garden, a group of women residents had gathered for some kind of public discussion. Unsettled by this intrusion into his private landscape, and its reminder that he was not yet alone in the apartment building, Royal retreated behind the rear wall of the sculpture garden. The voices moved around him, talking away, informally, as if this were the latest of many similar visits. Perhaps he had been asleep during their previous excursions, or with the cooler weather they had decided to move their meeting place further along the roof to the shelter of his penthouse. The vortex of birds was breaking up. As Royal returned to the penthouse, the spiral had begun to disintegrate. The gulls dived away from the face of the building far below. Urging the Alsatian ahead of him, Royal emerged from behind the rear wall of the sculpture garden. 2 of the women were standing inside the penthouse, one of them with a hand on the calisthenics machine. What startled Royal was their casual stance, as if they were about to move into a vacation villa they had recently rented. Royal retreated behind an elevator head. After being alone with the birds and the white Alsatian for so long, the sight of these human intruders unsettled him. He pulled the dog against his legs, deciding to wait in the sculpture garden until the visiting party had left. He pushed back the rear door of the garden and walked between the painted geometric forms. Dozens of the gulls surrounded him, crowded together on the tiled floor. They followed Royal expectantly, almost as if they had been waiting for him to bring something to them. His feet slipped on the wet tiles. Looking down, he found a piece of gristle attached to his shoe. Pulling it away, he leaned against one of the concrete sculptures, a waist-high sphere that had been painted bright carmine. When he drew his hand away, it was wet with blood. As the bird strutted ahead, clearing an open space for him, he saw that the whole interior of the play garden was drenched with blood. The tiled floor was slick with bright mucilage. The Alsatian snuffled greedily, wolfing down a shred of flesh lying by the edge of the paddling pool. Appalled, Royal stared at the blood-spattered tiles, at his bright hands, at the white bones picked clean by the birds. It was late afternoon when Wilder woke. Cold air moved through the empty room, flicking at a newspaper on the floor. The apartment was without shadows. Wilder listened to the wind moving down the ventilation shafts. The screaming of the gulls had ended, as if the birds had gone away forever. Wilder sat on the floor in a corner of the living room, an apex of this untenanted cube. Feeling the pressure of his back against the wall, he could almost believe that he was the first and last occupant of this apartment building. He climbed to his feet and walked across the floor to the balcony. Far below he could see the thousands of cars in the parking lots, but they were screened from him by a faint mist, part of the corroborative detail of a world other than his own. Sucking at the traces of animal fat that clung to his fingers, Wilder entered the kitchen. The cupboards and refrigerator were empty. He thought of the young woman and her warm body in the elevator beside the pool, wondering whether to go back to her. He remembered her stroking his chest and shoulders, and could feel the pressure of her hands on his skin. Still sucking his fingers and thinking of himself abandoned in this huge building, Wilder stepped out of the apartment. The corridor was silent, the cold air stirring the tags of refuse on the floor. He carried the cinecamera in his left hand, but he was no longer certain what its function was, or why he had kept it with him for so long. The silver pistol, by contrast, he recognized immediately. He held it in his right hand, pointing it playfully at the open doorways, and half hoping that someone would come out to join him in his game. The top floors of the building had been partially invaded by the sky. He saw white clouds through an elevator shaft, framed in the skylight of the stairwell as he climbed to the 40th floor. Fainting with the pistol, Wilder darted across the elevator lobby of the 40th floor. There were no barricades here, and a recent attempt had been made at housekeeping. The garbage sacks had been removed, the barricades dismantled, the lobby furniture reinstalled. Someone had scrubbed the walls, clearing away all traces of the graffiti, duty rosters, and elevator embarkation times. Behind him a door closed in the wind, cutting off a shaft of light. Enjoying this game with himself in the empty building, and certain that someone would soon turn up to play with him, Wilder dropped to one knee and leveled the pistol at an imaginary assailant. He darted down the corridor, kicked back the door, and burst into the apartment. The apartment was the largest he had seen in the building, far more spacious than any others on the upper floors. Like the lobby and corridor, the rooms had been carefully cleaned, the carpets relaid. The curtains hung around the high windows. On the polished dining-room table stood 2 silver candlesticks. Impressed by this sight, Wilder wandered around the gleaming table. In some confused way he felt that he had already been here, many years before he came to this empty building. The high ceiling and masculine furniture reminded him of a house he had visited as a small child. He wandered around the refurnished rooms, almost expecting to find his childhood toys, a cot and playpen laid out for his arrival. Between the bedrooms a private staircase led upwards to another chamber, and a small suite of rooms overlooking the roof. Excited by the mystery and challenge of this secret staircase, Wilder began to climb the steps. Licking the last of the fat from his fingers, he trumpeted happily to himself. He was halfway up the staircase, climbing towards the open air, when something blocked his path. The gaunt figure of a tall, white-haired man had stepped forward from the shadows. Far older than Wilder, his hair disheveled by the wind, he stood at the head of the staircase, looking down silently at the intruder below him. His face was concealed by the harsh light, but the scars on the bony points of his forehead stood out clearly, like the fresh hand-stains that marked his white jacket. Dimly recognizing this wild old man of the observation roof, Wilder stopped on the stairs. He was unsure whether Royal had come to play with him or to reprimand him. From Royal's nervous posture and his destitute appearance, Wilder guessed that he had been hiding somewhere, but not as part of the game. Hoping no less to enlist him, Wilder waved his pistol playfully at Royal. To his surprise, the architect flinched back, as if pretending to be frightened. As Wilder climbed towards him, he raised the chromium cane in his hand and hurled it down the staircase. The metal rod struck the handrail and whipped across Wilder's left arm. Stung by the pain of the blow, Wilder dropped the cinecamera. His arm was numb, and for a moment he felt helpless, like an abused child. As the architect advanced down the stairs towards him, Wilder raised the silver pistol and shot him through the chest. When the brief explosion had faded across the cold air, Wilder climbed the last of the steps. The architect's body lay awkwardly across the staircase, as if he were pretending to be dead. His scarred face, drained of all blood, was turned away from Wilder. He was still alive, staring through the open windows at the last of the birds that the explosion had driven into the air. Confused by this game and its unexpected turns, Wilder stepped over him. The cinecamera lay at the bottom of the staircase, but he decided to leave it there. Rubbing his injured arm, he threw away the pistol that had jarred his hand and stepped through the French windows. 20 yards away, children were playing in the sculpture garden. The doors, chained for so long to exclude them, were now wide open, and Wilder could see the geometric forms of the play sculptures, their vivid colors standing out against the white walls. Everything had been freshly painted, and the roof was vibrant with light. Wilder waved to the children, but none of them saw him. Their presence revived him, and he felt a surge of triumph at having climbed all the way to the roof to find them. The strange, scarred man in the blood-printed jacket lying on the steps behind him had not understood his game. One of the children, an infant boy of 2, was naked, running in and out of the sculptures. Quickly Wilder loosened his ragged trousers and let them fall to his ankles. Stumbling a little, as if he was forgetting how to use his legs, he ran forward naked to join his friends. In the center of the sculpture garden, beside the empty paddling pool, a woman was lighting a large fire from pieces of furniture. Her strong hands adjusted a heavy spit assembled from the chromium tubing of a large calisthenics device. She squatted beside the fire, stacking the chair legs as the children played together. Wilder walked forward, shyly hoping that the woman would notice the patterns painted across his chest. As he waited for the children to ask him to play with them, he saw that a second woman was standing 10 feet away to his left. She was wearing an ankle-length dress and a long gingham apron, her hair drawn back off her severe face and tied in a knot behind her neck. Wilder stopped among the statues, embarrassed that no one had noticed him. 2 more women, dressed in the same formal way, had appeared by the gate. Others were stepping forward among the sculptures, surrounding Wilder in a loose circle. They seemed to belong to another century and another landscape, except for their sunglasses, whose dark shades stood out against the blood-notched concrete of the roof terrace. Wilder waited for them to speak to him. He was glad to be naked and show off his body with its painted patterns. At last the woman kneeling by the fire looked over her shoulder at him. Despite her change of dress, he recognized her as his wife, Judith. He was about to run forward to her, but her matter-of-fact gaze, her unimpressed appraisal of his heavy loins, made him stop. By now he was aware that he knew all the women around him. Dimly he recognized Charlotte Melville, a scarf around her bruised throat, watching him without hostility. Standing next to Jane Sheridan was Royal's young wife, now a governess, supervising the smallest children. He recognized the jeweler's widow in her long fur coat, her face made up like his own body with red paint. Looking over his shoulder, if only to confirm that his escape was blocked, he could see the stately figure of the children's story writer seated in the open window of the penthouse, like a queen in her pavilion. In a last moment of hope, he thought that perhaps she would read him a story. In front of him, the children in the sculpture garden were playing with bones. The circle of women drew closer. The first flames lifted from the fire, the varnish of the antique chairs crackling swiftly. From behind their sunglasses the women were looking intently at Wilder, as if reminded that their hard work had given them a strong appetite. Together, Each removed something from a deep pocket of her apron. In their bloodied hands they carried knives with narrow blades. Shy, but happy now, Wilder tottered across the roof to meet his new mothers. Chapter 19. Night Games. Dinner was about to be served. Sitting on his balcony on the 25th floor, Robert Lang stirred the bright embers of the fire he had lit from pages of a telephone directory. The flames illuminated the handsome shoulders and thorax of the Alsatian roasting on its spit. Lang fanned the flames, hoping that Alice and Eleanor Powell, lying together in his sister's bed, would appreciate all he had done. He methodically basted the dark skin of the Alsatian, which he had stuffed with garlic and herbs. "One rule in life," he murmured to himself. "If you can smell garlic, everything is all right." For the moment, at least, everything was highly satisfactory. Factory. The Alsatian was almost cooked, and a large meal would do the women good. Both had become querulous recently as a result of the shortage of food, and had been too tired to appreciate Lang's skill and courage in capturing the dog, let alone the exhausting task of skinning and disemboweling this huge animal. They had even complained about its nervous whimperings as Lang turned the pages of an advanced cookery book he had found in a nearby apartment. Lang had debated for some time how best to cook the dog. From the extent of its shivering and whining, the problem had communicated itself to the Alsatian, as if it was aware that it was one of the last animals in the high-rise, and for that reason alone merited a major culinary effort. The thought of the weeks of hunger to come momentarily unsettled Lang, and he fed more sheets of paper into the balcony fire. Perhaps there was game to be found on the lower levels, though Lang never ventured below the 20th floor. The stench from the swimming pool on the 10th floor was too disturbing, and reached up every ventilation flue and elevator shaft. Lang had descended to the lower levels only once during the previous month, when he had briefly played Samaritan to Anthony Royal. Lang had found the dying architect while chopping firewood in the 25th floor lobby. As he pulled an antique dressing table from the disused barricade, Royal had fallen through the gap, almost knocking Lang to the floor. A small wound had opened Royal's chest, covering his white jacket with huge bloodstains in the outline of his hands, as if he had tried to identify himself with these imprints of his own death to come. He was clearly on his last legs, eyes unfocused, the bones of his forehead cutting through the overstretched skin. Somehow he had managed to descend all the way from the 40th floor. Rambling continually, he stumbled down the staircase, partly supported by Lang, until they reached the 10th floor. As they stepped onto the shopping mall, the stench of rotting flesh hung over the deserted counters of the supermarket, and at last Lang assumed that a concealed meat store had burst open and begun to putrefy. Appetite keening, he had been about to drop Royal and head off in search of food. But Royal, eyes almost closed, one hand gripping Lang's shoulder, pointed towards the swimming pool. In the yellow light reflected off the greasy tiles, the long tank of the bone pit stretched in front of them. The water had long since drained away, but the sloping floor was covered with skulls, bones, and dismembered limbs of dozens of corpses. Tangled together where they had been flung, they lay about like the tenants of a crowded beach visited by a sudden holocaust. Disturbed less by the sight of these mutilated bodies, residents who had died of old age or disease, and then been attacked by wild dogs, Lang assumed, than by the stench, Lang turned away. Royal, who had clung so fiercely to him during their descent of the building, no longer needed him, and dragged himself away along the line of changing cubicles. When Lang last saw him, he was moving towards the steps at the shallow end of the swimming pool, as if hoping to find a seat for himself on this terminal slope. Lang crouched over the fire, testing the hindquarters of the Alsatian with his skewer. He shivered in the cold air flowing up the face of the high-rise, with an effort repressing his memory of the bone pit. At times he suspected that some of the residents had reverted to cannibalism, the flesh that had been stripped with the surgeon's skill from many of the corpses. The lower-level residents, under constant pressure and discrimination, had probably given in to necessity. "Robert, what are you doing?" Alice's querulous voice roused Lang from his reverie. Wiping his hands on his apron, he hurried into the bedroom. "It's all right. Dinner's nearly ready." He spoke in the reassuring, childlike voice he had used during his hospital training with the duller of his child patients, a tone at variance with the intelligent and bored gaze of the two women in the bed. "You're filling the place up with smoke," Eleanor told him. "Are you sending up signals again?" "No, it's the telephone directories. The paper must be made of plastic." Alice shook her head wearily. "What about Eleanor's batteries? You promised to find some. She's got to start reviewing again." "Yes, I know." Lang looked down at the blank screen of the portable television set sitting on the floor beside Eleanor. He felt stumped for an answer. Despite all his efforts, the last of the batteries had been used. Eleanor stared at him severely. She had opened the wound on her wrist and was coyly exposing it to the cat, watching with interest from the far side of the room. "We've been discussing whether you should move to another apartment." "What?" Unsure whether the pantomime had become serious, Lang laughed delightedly, excited all the more when Eleanor refused to let her customary slow smile cross her mouth. The two women lay side by side, so close that they seemed to be merging into each other. At intervals throughout the day he brought them their food, but he was never sure exactly whose bodily needs and functions he was satisfying. They had moved into the same bed for warmth and security, but really, Lang suspected, so that they could synchronize their supervision over him. They knew that they were dependent on Lang. Despite the pantomime, their behavior was entirely geared to meeting Lang's private needs in return for his attention to the business of their physical survival. The exchange suited Lang admirably, just as it suited him to have them in bed together. He was faced with only one set of wheeling demands, one repertory of neurotic games. He liked to see Eleanor's old spirit emerge. Both women suffered seriously from malnutrition, and it encouraged him when they were well enough to play their parts in this loosely evolving pantomime, treating him like two governesses in a rich man's ménage, teasing a wayward and introspective child. At times Lang liked to carry the game to its logical conclusion, and imagined that it was the two women who were in charge, and that they despised him totally. This ultimate role had helped him on one occasion, when a marauding band of women led by Mrs. Wilder had entered the apartment. Seeing Lang being abused, and assuming him to be Eleanor's and Alice's prisoner, they had left. On the other hand, perhaps they understood all too well what was really taking place. Whatever the answer, Lang was free for the time being to live within this intimate family circle, the first he had known since his childhood. The situation allowed him ample freedom to explore himself, and the strong element of unpredictability kept everyone alert. Although he might wheedle at their breast, he could easily become vicious. The women admired him for this. A substantial number of morphine ampules were left, and he planned to introduce the two women to this heady elixir. Their addiction would tilt the balance of authority in his direction again, and increase their dependence on him. Ironically, it was here, in the high-rise, that he had found his first patients. Later, after he had carved the dog and served generous but not excessive portions to the two women, Lang thought about his good fortune as he sat on the balcony with his back to the railing. Above all, now, it no longer mattered how he behaved, what wayward impulses he gave way to, or which perverse pathways he chose to follow. He was sorry that Royal had died, as he owed the architect a debt of gratitude for having helped to design the high-rise and make all this possible. It was strange that Royal had felt any guilt before his death. Lang waved reassuringly to the two women, who sat on the mattress with the tray across their knees, eating from the same plate. Lang finished the dark, garlic-flavored meat and looked up at the face of the high-rise. All the floors were in darkness, and he felt happy at this. His affection for the two women was real, like his pride in keeping them alive, but this in no way interfered with his newfound freedom. On the whole, life in the high-rise had been kind to him. To an increasing extent, everything was returning to normal. Lang had begun to think again of the medical school. He might well pay a visit to the physiology laboratory the next day, and perhaps take a supervision. First, though, he would clean up. He had noticed two women neighbors sweeping the corridor. It might even be possible to get an elevator working. Perhaps he would take over a second apartment. dismantled the barricades, and began to refurnish it. Lang thought of Eleanor's threat to banish him. He toyed with the notion, feeling an illicit thrill of pleasure at the prospect. He would have to think of something with which to win their favor again. However, all this, like the morphine he would give them in increasing doses, was only a beginning, trivial rehearsals for the real excitements to come. Feeling these gather within him, Lang leaned against the railing. Dusk had settled, and the embers of the fire glowed in the darkness. The silhouette of the large dog on the spit resembled the flying figure of a mutilated man, soaring with immense energy across the night sky, embers glowing with the fire of jewels in his skin. Lang looked out at the high-rise 400 yards away. A temporary power failure had occurred, and on the 7th floor all the lights were out. Already torch beams were moving about in the darkness, as the residents made their first confused attempts to discover where they were. Lang watched them contentedly, ready to welcome them to their new world. High Rise, written by J.G. Ballard, narrated by Eric Eve Garcia. Copyright 1975 by J.G. Ballard. Production copyright 2013,